and welcome to the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by me, Hannah Erlmann. Well, I'm delighted to finally continue our investigation of the many problems discussed by Islamic theologians after what was initially meant to be a short summer break, but turned out to stretch into autumn. In any case, let us dive right back into the ocean of Islamic theology. As ardent listeners of the Kalamopod will know, in the previous episodes it emerged that theologians understood the task of their science to scrutinize religious dogmas and to provide them with a rational foundation. For instance, they scrutinized the dogma that God was the creator of the world, and they were not content with simply asserting that the Quran, the most fundamental religious text of Islam, described God in this way. Rather, they wanted to provide reason-based arguments in defense of this dogma. The same was the case with other religious problems, such as the divine attributes. Theological discussions took their starting point in the Quran, which describes God by a plenitude of attributes. But theologians wanted to make use of their God-given reason to establish just how God's nature had to be understood. Now, theologians were of course well aware that the Quran wasn't just a book putting forward religious dogmas. There was a lot more to be found in the Quran than the propagation of monotheism, descriptions of God's attributes, statements about how God created the world, and so on. In fact, from the earliest times of the community, Muslims were aware that the Quran contained quite a considerable number of prescriptions and rules of conduct. The Quran contains commandments and prohibitions. It recommends certain actions and criticizes others. Take as an example Quran 4:36, which commands, quote, "Worship God, join nothing with him, be good to your parents, to relatives, to orphans, to the needy, to neighbors near and far, to travelers in need, and to your slaves." Or Quran 2:219, which proclaims, "They ask you, Prophet, about intoxicants and gambling. Say, there's a great sin in both, and some benefit for people. The sin is greater than the benefit." It was Quranic statements on good conduct like these which sparked the interest of theologians and gave rise to yet another major controversy that divided the minds of adherents of different theological schools. You might wonder how it is that the practitioners of theology became interested in these Quranic prescriptions. That the practitioners of another science, namely jurisprudence, should have been interested in the Quranic commandments and prohibitions seems less surprising. You might be aware of the fact that parallel with the emergence of kalam, jurisprudence emerged, which unsurprisingly came to play a very important role in Muslim societies as well. Jurists busied themselves with finding legal verdicts relating to all sorts of issues you can imagine. They wanted to establish which actions should be deemed obligatory, prohibited, good or bad, and so on. In doing so, they also pondered over the underlying question of how Islamic law could be arrived at in the first place. There was no shortage of disagreement. Sure, the Quran held a prime position in the view of all jurists, being considered God's very word, in which God told humans how he wanted them to live. But there were other possible candidates besides the Quran, such as the utterances and deeds of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, which many, but not all, considered an authoritative example of right conduct and therefore as of legal relevance. And there was analogical reasoning, which was supposed to help the jurist reach a legal verdict about a new case, based on a previously decided case. In any case, Before jurists could get to work and determine the legal and moral status of this or that action, they felt that a set of fundamental questions had to be answered first. And this is where our theologians come in. The theologians basically took a step back from the jurists' discussion of this or that prescription or prohibition and asked some more basic questions. Where do moral values actually come from? Do they solely derive from God's revelation to humans, like when God declared that caring for orphans is a good deed? Or are our actions good or bad in themselves, independent of what God tells us in His revelation? And relating to these questions, the theologians asked the following. How do we humans actually come to know what is morally good and what is morally bad? Do we need God's revelation to know what we are supposed to do and supposed to leave? Or do we humans have the ability, by virtue of our God-given reason, to recognize, independent of revelation, that some actions are inherently good, while others are blameworthy? For example, does it take revelation for us to know that helping an innocent person in distress is a good thing to do? Or might we actually have an idea of the goodness of this action, independent of revelation? And finally, what about the obligations and prohibitions which God imposes on humans through His revelation? Is there a way for us to know of them before the arrival of revelation? Well, I think it has already become clear to you from the previous episodes of the Kalamopod that there was hardly any religious problem where we find the theologians in agreement about details. This is also the case with their debate about the origin of moral values and obligations on us humans, and that's what we want to look at in today's episode of the Kalamopod. There are two schools of theology whose position on this debate we should look at. They are the Mu'tazilites on the one hand and the Ash'arites on the other. There were, as you can imagine, other schools and individuals as well who had something to contribute to this debate. But we want to focus on the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites as, historically speaking, they considered themselves as arch opponents in this debate. And since they gave two very different, and therefore rather interesting answers to these questions. Let's start with the Mu'tazilites. In the academic literature, their position is often labeled objectivism, as they held that moral values have a real existence. They are real attributes of actions, in the same way as all other things in this world have real attributes. For instance, just as much as we humans can recognize that a tree has certain attributes like color and shape, which make it the tree it is, we humans can also recognize that the action of helping an innocent person in distress is characterized as good. In the case of the tree, it might be our senses, like sight, that help us recognize these attributes. In the case of actions, it is our human faculty of reason, which enables us to recognize their moral goodness or blameworthiness as attributes. It would thus be impossible, according to the Mu'tazilites, to think of the action of helping an innocent individual in danger without also recognizing that this is a morally good thing to do. Here's how the 12th century theologian Ghazali describes the position of the Mu'tazilites in his Al-Mustasfa fi Ilm al-Usul, or the essentials in the science of the principles of jurisprudence. And I should say that Ghazali himself was not a Mu'tazilite theologian, but belonged to the Ash'arite school. And his description is therefore immediately followed by a refutation of the Mu'tazilite position. But in any case, Ghazali's description is useful for us as it sums up nicely the Mu'tazilite position. So, Ghazali writes the following, and I'm quoting. The Mu'tazilites hold that actions are divided into good and evil. Some actions are such that they are perceived immediately by reason, such as the goodness of rescuing a drowning person and of thanking one's benefactor, or the blameworthiness of ingratitude and of inflicting pain on an innocent person and of a useless lie. They claim that goodness and blameworthiness are essential attributes for what is good and what is evil. They uphold that essentially blameworthy actions are prohibited for every person possessed of reason before the arrival of the revealed law, precisely because these actions are blameworthy by their very essence. The Ash'arites did not agree with their Mu'tazilite peers. They rejected the Mu'tazilites' objectivist position and upheld what in the academic literature is often labeled theistic subjectivism. As the term subjectivism indicates, the Ash'arites did not believe that moral values are real attributes of actions. Instead, they held that the goodness or blameworthiness of actions was determined by God alone. Humans come to know that helping an innocent person in distress is morally good only thanks to revelation and God's pronouncement that it is good. Reason, according to the Ash'arites, cannot determine that this action is good, because its goodness is not a real attribute belonging to the action, and so there simply is nothing there for reason to recognize. This implies that before the arrival of revelation, all moral assessments of actions made by humans are simply guesswork and have no true meaning. Morally good and morally bad is only what God made to be so. Before God's explicit declaration, actions simply have no moral value. Ash'arites then extended their position of moral values to the obligatoriness, prohibition, and permissibility of actions. Their position is therefore often also described as divine command theory. Just as much as the moral value of actions depends on God's determination and declaration, actions are made obligatory, prohibited, or permissible by God alone. Here's a quote from the 13th century theologian Fakhreddin Razi, which gets to the heart of the position of his school, that is, the Ash'arites. In an early work entitled Al-Irshad fi Ilm al-Kalam, or Guidance in the Science of Kalam, he writes the following, and I'm quoting. You should know that the position of the people of the truth is that good and evil are no real attributes. Rather, good and evil are only connected with what the lawgiver, and that is of course God, has said. If an action is permitted by him, it is called good. If it is prohibited by him, it is called evil. Once we have made it clear that the goodness and blameworthiness of actions, as well as their prohibition and permission, only derives from the revealed law, it will also be clear that actions may not be described with these terms before the arrival of the revealed law, and that thanking one's benefactor cannot be an obligation before the arrival of the revealed law. You see, the difference between Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites can be framed in terms of reason versus revelation. It goes to the heart of a fundamental question about the role of reason in religious matters. Sure, Mu'tazilites and Ash'arites both assume that human reason has its definite place in religion. It is indispensable for providing the believer with a rational basis for his or her belief, and without rational investigation of religious dogma, one did not even deserve being called a true Muslim. But the debate about the origin of moral values and obligations on humans shows that the Mu'tazilites went even further than the Ash'arites in their trust in what reason can tell us about religious problems. The Ash'arites, for their part, were uncomfortable with giving that much room to reason and instead made revelation the sole ground of moral values and obligations, as well as of our knowledge of them. It may come as little surprise that the Mu'tazilites were well aware that their position on the role of reason in knowing the moral value of certain actions could be misunderstood or even used against them. Their opponents could easily accuse them of dispensing with God's revelation altogether, since reason apparently is sufficient for us humans to know of ethical conduct. The Mu'tazilites were consequently eager to avert such an accusation and to stress that God's sending of prophets was necessary after all. Here is what the 11th century Mu'tazilite theologian Abdul-Jabbar argued in his Al-Mughni, or the complete work, and I'm quoting. You should know that reason comes to know of the obligatoriness of actions in a general way. In order to know the details of the obligatoriness of actions, further arguments based on reason or revelation are required. For example, when reason knows that returning something that has been entrusted to you is an obligation, and when you know that money falls under the things that have been entrusted to you, then you're obligated to return the money if you know that your companion demands it. If it is, however, the case that reason has no way of knowing the details, then revelation will provide them. To this, Abdul-Jabbar adds, and I'm quoting again, reason knows the obligatoriness of thanking and worshipping God, but it does not know by itself the specific actions by which God is to be worshipped, nor their conditions, nor the times when they should occur, nor the places where they should happen. So in any case, the sending of prophets is necessary. So here we find Abdul-Jabbar defending the characteristically Mu'tazilite position that reason knows some actions to be morally good or morally bad, and obligatory or prohibited, but that God's revelation is needed for humans to become familiar with the many details of how God wants them to lead their lives. And this latter aspect is precisely what the Ash'arites insisted on as well. By the way, the controversy between Ash'arites and Mu'tazilites over whether humans know of the moral value of certain actions, independent of what revelation has to say, was not unique to the Islamic context. We find similar controversies, for instance, among Christian thinkers. It seems that even though generations of thinkers have debated it over centuries, the controversy has not lost any of its relevance until today. Today, thinkers still engage in debates with titles such as, "Can we be moral without God?" And this might actually be a good question to ponder over on a lazy Saturday afternoon. Another good question to ponder over is how theologians thought they knew that Muhammad spoke the truth when he claimed to be a prophet sent by God, and that the Quran was God's revelation. Because of a miracle, you might exclaim, and that's precisely right. But what sort of miracle, or miracles, was it that, according to the theologians, proved the divine origin of the Quran? Well, this story has to wait till the next episode of the Kalamopod, the one and only podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology, hosted by Hannah Ehlmann. Thanks for listening, and hear you soon.